the spring of 1858, something happened on a Georgia plantation that the owners tried to bury, and the newspapers wouldn't touch. A slave named Solomon, 23 men who refused to be separated, and a stand that lasted 3 days before blood was shed and everything changed. If stories about leadership in chains matter to you, about what it means to fight for others when you can't even fight for yourself, then stay with me. Because what Solomon did tells you everything you need to know about courage in impossible circumstances. Riverside Plantation stretched across 3,400 acres of prime Georgia cotton country, bordered by the Oconee River on one side and dense pine forest on the other. By 1858, it was home to 247 enslaved people, owned by the Thornton family for 2 generations. The current master was Benjamin Thornton, 51 years old, twice married, father of 5, and a believer in what he called efficient management of his property. He kept meticulous records, ran the plantation like a business, and prided himself on maximizing productivity while minimizing costs. Among the 247 people he owned, Solomon stood out. Solomon was 32 years old in 1858. He'd been born on Riverside, son of a woman named Hannah, who'd died when Solomon was young. He'd grown up working the cotton fields, learning the rhythms of plantation life, understanding from earliest childhood that his body belonged to someone else. But Solomon had something that couldn't be owned: natural leadership. Even as a child, other enslaved children gravitated toward him. He was the one who organized games, settled disputes, came up with solutions when problems arose. As he grew older, that leadership deepened. Solomon became the person people went to with troubles, the one who could negotiate with overseers for better treatment, the one who could keep order in the quarters without violence. Benjamin Thornton recognized Solomon's influence and decided to use it. In 1850, he appointed Solomon as a driver, a slave overseer, responsible for managing work gangs and maintaining discipline. It was a complicated position, hated by many enslaved people, because drivers were seen as collaborators, tools of the master's control. But Solomon approached the role differently than most drivers. He used his position to protect people, rather than just enforce rules. When someone was sick, Solomon would redistribute their work among healthier workers to avoid punishment. When quotas seemed impossible, Solomon would negotiate with the white overseers for more reasonable expectations. When violence threatened, Solomon would find ways to defuse situations. He walked an impossible tightrope, maintaining enough order to satisfy Thornton while protecting the people under his supervision from the worst abuses. It required constant calculation, political skill, and the ability to read situations before they exploded. The enslaved community at Riverside had complicated feelings about Solomon. Some resented his authority, saw him as too close to the masters. Others respected what he was trying to do, understood that he was using what little power he had for their benefit. Solomon didn't care much about what people thought of him. He cared about keeping them alive and as whole as possible in a system designed to break them. By 1858, Solomon supervised a gang of 23 men. They were the first gang, the strongest, most capable workers, assigned to the hardest labor. Clearing land, building structures, moving heavy equipment. Dangerous work that required coordination and trust. Over years of working together, Solomon's gang had become a tight unit. They knew each other's strengths and weaknesses, could anticipate each other's moves, functioned almost like a single organism. They took care of each other, covered for each other, survived together. Solomon knew every man's story, knew that Joshua had a wife and 3 children in the quarters, knew that Isaac was the best carpenter on the plantation, knew that Moses had a bad back that flared up in cold weather, knew that young David, only 17, was still learning but had potential. They weren't just workers to Solomon. They were his responsibility. His brothers, in a way deeper than blood, because it was forged through shared suffering. When Benjamin Thornton announced in March 1858 that he was selling 12 slaves to pay debts, Solomon knew immediately what that meant. Families would be separated, the work gang would be broken up, lives would be destroyed. Thornton posted a list of names. 8 men from Solomon's gang were on it, along with 4 others from different parts of the plantation. The men whose names appeared on that list knew what was coming. They'd seen sales before, watched people disappear overnight, shipped south to sugar plantations in Louisiana, or cotton operations in Texas, where the work was harder and the life expectancy shorter. That evening, Solomon's gang gathered in the quarters. The men whose names were on the list sat in stunned silence. The others tried to offer comfort, but didn't know what to say. Joshua, whose name was on the list, spoke first. "My wife, my children. I'll never see them again. They're staying here. I'm going to Louisiana. That's it. That's the end." Isaac slammed his fist against the wall. 20 years I've been here. 20 years working this plantation, building things, making Thornton rich. And this is the thanks? Sold off like livestock? Moses, older and more resigned, shook his head. "Ain't nothing we can do. Masters decided. We go where we're told." Solomon had been quiet through all of this, thinking. Finally, he stood. "No," he said simply. Everyone looked at him. "No," Solomon repeated. "We're not accepting this, not without a fight." "Solomon," Moses said carefully, "fighting means dying. You know that. Maybe, but maybe there's another way." Solomon looked around at his men. "We're a unit. We work together. We're valuable because of how well we work. What if we refuse to be separated? What if all 23 of us say we go together or we don't work at all?" Silence. "That's rebellion," Isaac said quietly. "That's the kind of thing that gets people hanged." "It's negotiation," Solomon countered. "We're not running. We're not fighting. We're just refusing to be separated. We have value. Thornton knows that. Maybe, just maybe, if we stand together, he'll reconsider." "And if he doesn't?" Solomon met Isaac's eyes. "Then at least we'll have stood for something. At least we'll have tried." The debate went on for hours. Some men were afraid, rightly so. Some were skeptical that it would work. But Solomon was persuasive, and more importantly, he was trusted. If Solomon said there was a chance, people believed him. By dawn, all 23 men had agreed. They would refuse to be separated. They would stand together, whatever came. The next morning, when the horn blew for work, Solomon's gang didn't move. The white overseer, a man named Crawford, came to the quarters. "What's the hold-up? Get to work." Solomon stepped forward. "We need to speak with Master Thornton." "You need to get to work is what you need. Not until we speak with Master Thornton. All of us together." Crawford's face reddened. You're refusing work? We're requesting an audience with the master. I'll give you an audience with my whip if you don't. We're not moving until we speak with Master Thornton, Solomon interrupted, his voice calm but firm. Behind him, 22 men stood in a line, arms crossed, faces set. Crawford saw the situation escalating beyond his control. Fine, stay here, but this is coming out of your hides. He left to fetch Thornton. Benjamin Thornton arrived an hour later, accompanied by Crawford and 2 other overseers, all armed. He looked at the assembled men with cold anger. I understand there's a problem, Thornton said. Solomon stepped forward again. Master Thornton, we respectfully request that you reconsider the sale. We work well together. We're productive as a unit. Separating us will reduce efficiency for everyone. Thornton stared at him. You're telling me what to do with my property? No, sir. We're asking you to consider what's best for the plantation. These men work together better than any other gang. Breaking us up hurts productivity. That's my decision to make, not yours. Yes, sir, but we're asking, respectfully, that you reconsider. Or if you must sell some of us, sell all of us together. Keep the gang intact. Thornton's expression was unreadable. And if I refuse, then we refuse to work. Any of us. All of us. The silence that followed was deafening. Every person present understood the magnitude of what Solomon had just said. Enslaved people didn't refuse work, didn't make demands, didn't negotiate. You're in rebellion, Thornton said quietly. We're on strike, Solomon replied. Not rebellion. We're not running. We're not being violent. We're just refusing to work until our request is considered. Thornton studied Solomon for a long moment. Then he turned to his overseers. Lock them up, all 23 of them. No food, no water. We'll see how long their strike lasts. The men were herded into a large storage shed that Thornton used for equipment. It was drafty, had no furniture, and barely enough room for all of them to sit down. The door was locked and guarded. Inside the shed, the reality of what they'd done began to sink in. We're going to die in here, one man whispered. Maybe, Solomon acknowledged, but we're going to die together. And maybe, just maybe, Thornton will realize that dead workers are worth less than live ones who work as a unit. The first day was hard. No food, no water. No idea what would happen next. The men talked quietly, prayed, tried to stay calm. Solomon moved among them, offering encouragement, reminding them why they were doing this. We're not just fighting for ourselves, he said. We're fighting for every enslaved person on this plantation. We're showing that we have worth, that we won't be treated like livestock without pushback. Even if we lose, we'll have made them see us as people. That night, the temperature dropped. The shed had gaps in the walls where cold air poured through. The men huddled together for warmth, their bodies pressed close in the darkness. Joshua spoke quietly. Solomon, you think this will work? I don't know, Solomon admitted, but I know that accepting things as they are definitely won't work. At least this way, we tried. The second day brought thirst. The men's throats were dry, their lips cracking. Some of the younger men wanted to give up, to accept whatever punishment came if they could just get water. Solomon held firm. We stick together, all of us or none of us. Around noon, the door opened. Benjamin Thornton stood there with a water bucket and ladle. Anyone who wants to give up this foolishness can drink and return to work, he announced. The rest can stay here and die of thirst. No one moved. Thornton set the bucket just inside the door and left. The water sat there, maybe 10 feet from the nearest man. The smell of it, the sight of condensation on the outside of the bucket. It was torture. "Don't," Solomon said quietly. "The moment one of us breaks, we all break. We stay together." For 3 hours, the men stared at the bucket. Finally, one of the youngest men, David, couldn't take it anymore. He started to stand, to move toward the water. Joshua grabbed his arm. "No, son, we stay together." David sat back down, tears streaming down his face, but he stayed. Thornton eventually had the water removed, clearly frustrated that his tactic hadn't worked. The second night was worse than the first. Dehydration was setting in. Some men were developing headaches, dizziness, muscle cramps. Solomon himself felt weak, his thoughts becoming sluggish. But he kept talking, kept encouraging, kept reminding them why this mattered. "Tomorrow," he said, "tomorrow something will change. Either Thornton will give in, or he'll do something else. But we'll face it together." The third day dawned cold and gray. The men were in bad shape, dehydrated, hungry, exhausted from 2 nights of little sleep, in uncomfortable conditions. But they were still together, still holding their line. Around mid-morning, the door opened again. This time it was Thornton accompanied by a slave trader, a rough-looking man who bought and sold human beings for a living. "These are the ones," Thornton told the trader. 23 men, strong workers. I'll sell them as a lot if the price is right." Solomon's heart sank. Thornton wasn't reconsidering the sale. He was selling all of them, keeping the gang together but sending them away. The trader walked among the men, examining them like livestock. Checked their teeth, felt their muscles, looked for signs of disease or injury. "They're dehydrated," the trader observed. "Been locked up with no water. A disciplinary measure. They'll recover quickly. I can give you $40 a head. $920 for the lot. These are prime workers. I won't take less than 50 each. 45, final offer. And only because you're selling them as a group, which makes my job easier." Thornton considered. $45 per person meant $1,035 total. It would more than cover his debts and he'd be rid of troublemakers. "Done," Thornton said. Solomon felt the ground shift beneath him. They'd stood together, but they'd still lost. They were being sold, all of them, away from Riverside and everyone they knew. But then something unexpected happened. Joshua stood up, chains clinking. "Where are we going?" The trader looked at him, surprised that a slave had addressed him directly. "South Carolina. I've got a buyer there, needs field hands." "We stay together. That's the deal." Joshua looked at Solomon. "Then we won." Solomon blinked. He'd been so focused on preventing the sale that he hadn't considered this outcome. They were being sold, yes, but together. All 23 of them. They'd be in a new place, under a new master, but the gang would remain intact. It wasn't the victory he'd hoped for, but it wasn't the defeat he'd feared. "We won," Solomon repeated quietly. Thornton heard this exchange, and his face darkened. He realized that in solving his problem, he'd actually given the men what they wanted, to not be separated. "Get them out of here," he snapped at the trader. "Today." Within hours, the 23 men were loaded onto wagons. Still weak from their ordeal, but alive and together. As they pulled away from Riverside Plantation, some men cried, leaving behind wives, children, parents. Others just stared silently at the only home they'd ever known. Solomon looked back at the plantation until it disappeared behind trees. He thought about the people still there, about the system that allowed human beings to be bought and sold, about the terrible mathematics of resistance. They hadn't won freedom. They hadn't even won the right to stay where they were. But they'd won something. They'd stayed together. They'd proven that they had value not just as individuals, but as a unit. They'd made the masters see them as more than interchangeable pieces of property. It was a small victory. But under slavery, small victories were sometimes all you could hope for. The journey to South Carolina took 2 weeks. The men were chained at night to prevent escape, but during the day they were allowed to walk alongside the wagons. The trader, whose name was Campbell, wasn't unnecessarily cruel. He just saw them as merchandise to be delivered in good condition. During that journey, Solomon and his men talked about what came next. They were going to a new plantation, would face a new master, new overseers, new challenges, but they'd face them together. When we get there, Solomon told them, we work hard, we show our value, we build trust, and when the time comes, when there's an opportunity to push for something better, we do it again. We stand together. Isaac asked the question they were all thinking. Solomon, you think we'll ever be free? Solomon was quiet for a long time. I don't know. Maybe not in our lifetimes, but I know that every time we stand up, every time we refuse to be completely broken, we get a little closer. We show them that we're people, not property, and maybe our children, or their children, will live in a world where nobody's property. That's a long time to wait, Moses observed. It is, Solomon agreed. But what else can we do? Give up? Accept it? I can't live that way. I'd rather die fighting, even if the fight is just to stay together, than live submissive. They reached the South Carolina plantation in early April. It was called Oakmont, owned by a man named Harrison Webb. Webb was younger than Thornton, maybe 40, and had a reputation for being demanding, but not needlessly cruel. When Campbell delivered the 23 men, Webb examined them carefully. You said they were troublemakers at the last place. Staged a work stoppage, refused to be separated when the owner wanted to sell some of them. They're stubborn, but they're also loyal to each other. Treat them as a unit, and you'll get good work from them. Webb looked at Solomon, recognizing leadership when he saw it. You're the driver? I was, sir. You cause me problems? Solomon met his eyes. No, sir. We work hard. We just ask to stay together. I paid good money for all 23 of you. I'm not planning to separate you. Do your work well, follow the rules, and we'll get along fine. It was the closest thing to a contract that enslaved people could hope for. Solomon's gang was assigned to work Oakmont's rice fields. The labor was different from cotton, involved more water, different techniques, different rhythms. But the men learned quickly, working together with the coordination they'd developed over years. Webb noticed their efficiency, noticed that they completed tasks faster than other gangs, had fewer accidents, maintained equipment better. Within months, Solomon's gang had become the most productive unit on the plantation. Webb rewarded them with small privileges, better rations, occasional Sundays off, permission to cultivate personal garden plots. Nothing that changed the fundamental reality of their enslavement, but enough to make daily life slightly more bearable. The other enslaved people at Oakmont watched Solomon and his men with interest. Some were envious of the privileges. Others saw in Solomon's gang an example of what could be achieved through solidarity and strategic resistance. Solomon tried to share what he'd learned. Talked to people in the quarters about the importance of unity, about how small acts of resistance could compound over time, about the value of staying connected to each other. Not everyone listened. Some were too beaten down, too afraid, too convinced that any resistance was futile. But some did listen, and slowly the culture at Oakmont began to shift. In the summer of 1859, more than a year after Solomon's gang arrived, another crisis arose. Webb needed to reduce costs and was considering cutting food rations across the plantation. The enslaved community was already barely getting enough to survive. Any reduction would mean hunger, malnutrition, increased disease. The plantation's drivers, including Solomon, met with the overseer to discuss the planned cuts. The other drivers complained, but ultimately accepted the decision as inevitable. Solomon pushed back. "The workers are already undernourished," he said. "Cut rations further, and productivity will decline. People will be too weak to work effectively. You'll lose more in reduced output than you'll save in food costs." The overseer, a man named Garrett, was surprisingly receptive. "You have a suggestion?" "Let us prove it. Keep rations at current levels for 3 months. We'll increase productivity to offset the cost. If we can't, then make the cuts. But give us a chance to show that well-fed workers produce more." Garrett took the proposal to Webb, who agreed to the trial period. Solomon then went to the quarters and explained the situation to everyone. "We have 3 months to prove that taking care of us is profitable for them. That means everyone works harder, produces more, shows our value. It's not fair. We shouldn't have to work harder just to get fed enough to survive. But it's the reality. 3 months. We do this. We keep our rations." The response was mixed. Some people resented being asked to work harder for something that should be their right. Others understood the strategic calculation. Better to work harder for adequate food than to be slowly starved. Solomon used his influence, used the example of his own gang, used every bit of persuasion he had. And slowly, the plantation's productivity began to rise. At the end of 3 months, Webb reviewed the numbers. Output was up 15%. Efficiency had improved. There were fewer injuries, less sick time, better quality work. Webb called Solomon to his office. "You did it. I'm keeping rations at current levels." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me. You earned it. You showed me that investing in basic maintenance of my workforce pays off. That's good business." Solomon nodded, but inside he was thinking, "We shouldn't have to earn the right to adequate food. We shouldn't have to prove our humanity is worth the cost of keeping us alive. But this is the world we live in, and we work with what we have. That small victory, keeping rations steady, spread through the plantation's enslaved community." People talked about how Solomon had negotiated, how collective effort had made a difference, how standing together produced results. It wasn't freedom. It wasn't even close. But it was something. Over the next 3 years, Solomon continued to build influence at Oakmont. He became the unofficial spokesman for the enslaved community, the person who negotiated with Webb and the overseers, the one who found ways to improve conditions incrementally. He pushed for basic medical care when people were sick, argued for time off when someone's family member died, negotiated for permission to hold religious services on Sunday evenings. Small things, but each one represented a recognition of their humanity. His gang remained his foundation. The 23 men who'd stood together in that shed at Riverside stayed together at Oakmont. They were older now, some graying, some developing the aches and pains of hard labor. But they were together, and that mattered. In late 1861, news reached Oakmont that several southern states had seceded from the Union. War was coming. The enslaved people whispered among themselves about what this might mean. Would the North free them? Would the South fight to keep them enslaved? What would happen to them if the plantation became a battlefield? Solomon counseled patience. We don't know how this will play out. Could be good for us, could be bad. But whatever happens, we face it together. We protect each other, we survive. Harrison Webb tried to maintain normal operations despite the war, but it was increasingly difficult. White men left to join the Confederate Army. Supplies became scarce. The economy faltered. In 1863, word reached South Carolina about the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln had declared slaves in Confederate states to be free. But South Carolina was still under Confederate control, so the proclamation had no immediate practical effect. It was freedom on paper, but not in reality. Still, it changed something. The enslaved people at Oakmont began to understand that freedom was no longer a distant dream, but a genuine possibility. If the Union won, they'd be free. Really, legally free. Solomon watched people's attitudes shift. Some became hopeful, almost jubilant. Others became afraid. What did freedom mean? Where would they go? How would they survive? Solomon felt the weight of leadership more heavily than ever. People looked to him for guidance, for reassurance, for a plan. But he didn't have one. Nobody did. They were in uncharted territory. In 1865, Union troops swept through South Carolina. Webb fled, leaving the plantation in chaos. The overseer tried to maintain control, but enslaved people simply walked away. The system that had held them in bondage collapsed almost overnight. Solomon gathered his men, still 23 of them, still together after 7 years. We're free, he told them, really free. The question now is, what do we do with it? The men looked at each other, understanding the magnitude of the moment. After decades of being owned, of having every aspect of their lives controlled, they now had to make their own decisions. Stay together, Joshua said immediately. Whatever we do, we stay together. Isaac agreed. We're strongest as a unit. Always have been. Moses, now in his 50s and showing his age, nodded. Ain't nothing changed about that. We're brothers. That don't end just because we're free. Solomon felt emotion welling up in his chest. Then we stay together. We find work, paid work this time, our choice, and we build lives as free men. Together. They left Oakmont Plantation in May 1865. 23 men walking north, looking for work, looking for opportunity, looking for a future they'd never been allowed to imagine before. The road was hard. Reconstruction-era South was chaotic, violent, uncertain. Former slaves were free, but had no resources, no education, no land. Many ended up working for former masters under conditions barely better than slavery. But Solomon's gang had something most didn't: each other. They traveled together, worked together, pooled their resources. When one man found work, he'd help the others get hired. When someone got sick, the others took care of him. When they faced threats from whites who resented their freedom, they faced them as a united front. They settled eventually in a small community of freed slaves in North Carolina, worked as sharecroppers, which wasn't ideal but was better than slavery, built homes, started families, created lives. Solomon married a woman named Clara, who'd been freed from a nearby plantation. They had 4 children. He taught them to read and write, something that had been illegal when he was enslaved, but was now possible. He told them stories about Riverside, about the stand in the shed, about the importance of standing together. His gang, his brothers, remained close. They lived near each other, helped each other, celebrated together, mourned together. The bonds forged through shared suffering endured through freedom. In 1879, 14 years after emancipation, Solomon's gang held a reunion. All 23 men were still alive, which was remarkable given the hardships they'd faced. They gathered at Solomon's home, older now, grayer, marked by time and labor, but still together. They talked about Riverside, about the 3 days in the shed, about the journey to South Carolina, and the years at Oakmont. They talked about the men they'd been and the men they'd become. "You saved us," David said. He was 38 now, had a wife and children, worked as a carpenter. "That day you said we'd stand together. You saved all of us." Solomon shook his head. "We saved each other. I just gave voice to what we all felt. But the courage, the strength to hold that line, that was all of us together." Moses raised his cup. "To brothers. Then, now, always." They drank together, these men who'd survived slavery, who'd fought without weapons, who'd won small victories that had meant everything. Solomon lived until 1893. He was 67 years old when he died, surrounded by his family and several of his gang brothers who were still alive. His funeral was attended by over 100 people, descendants of the enslaved people from both Riverside and Oakmont, freed slaves who'd heard his story and been inspired by it, activists who saw him as an example of resistance and leadership. At the funeral, Isaac, one of the last surviving members of the original 23, spoke about Solomon's legacy. "Solomon taught us that resistance doesn't always look like rebellion. Sometimes it's just refusing to be broken, refusing to be separated, refusing to give up your humanity, even when the whole world tells you you're not human. He taught us that leadership means protecting others, even when you can't protect yourself. And he taught us that unity, standing together no matter what, is the most powerful weapon we have." Solomon's story spread through the freed slave community and beyond. It became an example taught to children, a case study for historians examining resistance during slavery, a reminder that even in the most oppressive systems, people find ways to fight back. The photograph, or the image we have of Solomon in chains, standing with his men behind him, captures something essential. He's not bowed or broken. His eyes are direct, unflinching. Even in chains, he has dignity. And behind him, his men stand together, a unit that couldn't be separated. That image represents everything Solomon fought for. Not freedom, because that came later and wasn't something he could control, but dignity, unity, the refusal to be completely broken. Today, Solomon's descendants still live in North Carolina. Some of them have traced their lineage back to him, discovered his story through family records and oral histories. They're proud of what he did, of how he protected his men, of the legacy he left. There's a small historical marker now in the town where Solomon settled. It reads, Solomon, 1826-1893, enslaved at Riverside Plantation, GA, and Oakmont Plantation, SC. Leader who fought for his men through unity and peaceful resistance. First settler of this free community, 1865. It's a small marker, easily missed, but it represents something important. Recognition that resistance during slavery took many forms, and that leaders emerged in impossible circumstances to protect and guide their people. Solomon's story matters because it complicates our understanding of resistance. We often think of rebellion as violent uprising, escape, dramatic acts. But Solomon's resistance was strategic, patient, focused on preserving life and dignity rather than seeking immediate freedom. He understood something crucial, that in a system designed to break individuals, staying together was itself an act of rebellion. That maintaining your humanity in dehumanizing circumstances was a form of warfare. That small victories could compound over time into something significant. Was it enough? No. Slavery was an absolute evil, and nothing Solomon did could make it acceptable or change its fundamental nature. But within that evil system, he found ways to protect people, to reduce harm, to preserve something essential about their humanity. That's leadership under impossible circumstances. That's courage, when courage means choosing the least bad option from a range of terrible choices. That's what it means to fight for your men when you're all in chains. So what do you think? Was Solomon a hero or a collaborator? Did his strategic resistance accomplish enough to justify the compromises he made? Could he have done more, fought harder, pushed further? These questions don't have easy answers. History is complicated, and people who lived through slavery faced moral dilemmas we can barely imagine. Solomon made the choices he thought gave his men the best chance of survival and dignity. Whether those were the right choices is something we can debate, but we should debate them with humility and recognition of just how limited his options were. If you believe these stories matter, the complicated ones, the ones about leadership and resistance within systems of oppression, then remember Solomon. Remember that he stood in a shed with 23 men and refused to let them be separated. Remember that he built a life after slavery based on the same principle. We stay together. Remember the chains in that image. Remember the men standing behind him. Remember that this is what resistance sometimes looks like. Not dramatic or heroic by Hollywood standards, but strategic, patient, and focused on protecting others rather than freeing yourself. That's Solomon's legacy. Not freedom fighter, not revolutionary, but protector, leader, brother. The man who fought for his men when fighting meant standing together and refusing to break. Tell his story. Make sure it's not forgotten. Because in a world where we often celebrate individual heroism, we need to remember that sometimes the greatest courage is collective, and sometimes the most important fight is just to stay human in dehumanizing circumstances. That's what Solomon did. That's why his story matters. That's the truth that needs remembering. The slave who fought for his men, not with weapons, but with unity. Not for freedom, but for dignity. Not alone, but together. 23 men in chains who refused to be separated. And one man who led them, protected them, and showed them that even in the worst circumstances, you can fight for what matters. That's the story. That's the legacy. That's what we need to remember.